It seemed good to me and the Holy Ghost that in 2024 we're on victory's shore. We're still there.
You won't believe what happened in court today. Kenneth Copeland, the famous televangelist, was facing his sentence, and the tension in the room was unbearable. As the judge read the verdict, something shocking unfolded. Copeland collapsed right there in the courtroom. Witnesses say it was sudden, chaotic, and left everyone in stunned silence. This moment has everyone talking, raising questions about his health, his future, and what comes next in a story that's only getting more intense. The courtroom was unusually silent that morning, the kind of silence that makes every small sound echo. Kenneth Copeland, once a towering figure in televangelism, stood at the front, his face a mix of nerves and anticipation. For decades, he had preached about prosperity, claiming that faith could bring wealth, success, and divine favor. He had spoken to millions, built an empire of private jets, sprawling mansions, and luxurious gifts, all funded by the unwavering faith of his followers. But today, the sermon was over, and the reality of the law was about to hit him like a hammer. The judge's voice cut through the air, steady but heavy, delivering the sentence that no one could ignore. 20 years. Fraud, tax evasion, misappropriation of charitable funds. Copeland's empire, built on the promises of God and prosperity, had been scrutinized and torn apart by investigators and former insiders. The courtroom was tense, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see how the man who had once commanded such absolute devotion would react. And then it happened. In an instant, the confident, commanding preacher seemed to vanish. His knees buckled, his hands grasped the edge of the table, and he collapsed to the floor, a human being overwhelmed by the weight of his own actions and the consequences catching up to him. Gasps filled the room, followed by a flurry of movement. Security officers rushed to his side, reporters scrambled for footage, and his legal team tried desperately to shield him from the chaos. The spectacle was both shocking and strangely symbolic. This was a man who had once stood above the crowd, preaching that faith could move mountains, now brought low by the very system he had long seemed untouchable by. The fall was literal and metaphorical, a collapse that represented decades of hubris, manipulation, and the ultimate vulnerability of a life built on appearances. People whispered and speculated, was it a physical reaction to shock? Or had the emotional weight of losing everything, the ministry, the wealth, the followers, finally become too much to bear? For years, allegations had lingered in the background, dismissed by loyal supporters as attacks from envious outsiders. But now, with Copeland lying on the courtroom floor, those whispers had transformed into undeniable reality. The preacher who once commanded a global audience had been reduced to a man struggling to stay upright under the pressure of his own crimes. In that moment, the world saw what his followers had never seen. Kenneth Copeland was human, fallible, and finally accountable. Kenneth Copeland had built his name on faith, prosperity, and the promise of divine favor. But behind the golden microphones and the sprawling estates lay a financial empire that was far more complex and far more fragile than most people realized. For decades, Copeland's ministry had been a powerhouse, broadcasting sermons to millions of viewers, collecting donations, and inspiring people to believe that their faith could bring them wealth, health, and success. On the surface, it was a story of triumph, but beneath it, there were cracks that few could see. And over time, those cracks widened until the empire he had so carefully constructed began to unravel. It started slowly. Reports from insiders, former employees, and whistleblowers had hinted at irregularities for years. There were rumors of lavish spending, of jets, mansions, and luxury cars being purchased with money that was supposed to support missions, feed the hungry, or expand ministry outreach. Most followers dismissed these concerns. After all, Copeland had preached that prosperity was a sign of God's blessing. If he flew on private jets or lived in opulent homes, it was proof that faith worked, right? But those who worked inside the ministry knew a different story, a story of careful planning, hidden accounts, and financial maneuvers designed to protect the wealth of one man while keeping the public perception of charity intact. The first real cracks appeared when a former senior accountant came forward. In hushed tones, he explained how millions of dollars from donations were redirected into private accounts, shell corporations, and offshore holdings. These weren't simple mistakes or accounting errors. They were deliberate, orchestrated moves meant to hide the flow of funds. Every dollar that should have gone to charitable work, to missions, or to helping those in need had a different destination: Copeland himself. Private jets were registered under shell companies. Real estate purchases were disguised as ministry properties, but were, in reality, personal estates with gold-plated fixtures and wine cellars worth more than the yearly income of many families in the congregation. The more the truth came out, the more it became clear that Copeland's empire had been built on a carefully maintained illusion. Then came the testimonies from former employees. People who had worked in the financial offices of the ministry spoke of strict orders not to question anything. If a donation went missing, if an expense seemed unusual, it was not to be questioned. Questioning Kenneth was like questioning God himself, one former staffer admitted in court. There were threats, subtle and overt, meant to enforce compliance. Employees who dared to challenge irregularities risked losing their jobs, being blacklisted, or worse, being publicly humiliated. Over time, fear became a central part of how the empire operated. People did as they were told, and the flow of money continued, untouchable and hidden. The revelations didn't stop there. Investigators uncovered that some of the ministry's most loyal followers had been manipulated into making extreme financial commitments. They were convinced that their donations would be returned tenfold by divine intervention, that their faith was the key to unlocking unimaginable blessings. Entire life savings were given, homes were mortgaged, credit limits maxed out, all in the hope that God's favor, as promised by Copeland, would transform their lives. But the money never went to spiritual growth or charitable causes. It went toward private jets, luxury vacations, and secret offshore accounts. One widow's story captured the human cost perfectly. She had donated her late husband's entire life insurance payout, believing it would help others and honor God. Instead, it financed a mansion with marble floors and a wine cellar. Her tears in court reflected the pain of thousands, the human fallout of a system that had disguised greed as divine purpose. As the court proceedings continued, the full scale of the financial empire's unraveling became impossible to ignore. The IRS launched parallel investigations, tracing hidden accounts, offshore trusts, and shell companies. Donations dropped sharply as followers began to realize the extent of the mismanagement and deception. Television programs that once broadcast Copeland's sermons were canceled, and the staff who had shielded him for decades started leaving, either voluntarily or under legal pressure. The empire that had seemed untouchable, one that had spanned decades and continents, began to collapse from within. Copeland himself tried to maintain control, issuing instructions to remaining ministry members, urging broadcasts of old sermons, and attempting to project an image of normalcy. But it was impossible to stem the tide. The wealth that had defined him was being seized. Properties were confiscated, offshore accounts intercepted. What was once a gilded empire of faith and fortune was now a tangle of legal filings, frozen assets, and public disgrace. The narrative that had sustained Copeland for decades, that wealth was a sign of divine favor, that the ministry's growth was a reflection of God's blessing, had crumbled under scrutiny. In the end, the unraveling of Kenneth Copeland's financial empire was a combination of hubris, meticulous planning, and the illusion of divinity. What had been presented as a holy mission, a conduit for spiritual abundance, was revealed to be a carefully constructed system that enriched one man at the expense of countless believers. The fall was dramatic, public, and irreversible. From private jets and mansions to federal prison and seizure of assets, the journey of his financial empire showed the fragility of even the most seemingly untouchable institutions when greed, fear, and deception formed their foundation. Copeland's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how power and wealth can corrupt even those who claim to serve a higher purpose. Kenneth Copeland had spent decades building not just a ministry, but a network of loyalty and support that seemed unbreakable. For years, he had surrounded himself with staff, advisors, family members, and followers who were devoted to him and his message of prosperity and divine favor. In the bright lights of his television broadcasts, he appeared untouchable, a man whose authority was unquestioned and whose power seemed absolute. But when the allegations of financial misconduct came to light, the very foundations of that support began to crumble, revealing just how fragile loyalty can be when confronted with scandal and truth. It started subtly, Whispers among employees and former associates suggested unease, and some began quietly distancing themselves from Copeland. The fear that had long kept people in line, the fear of challenging the man of God, was no longer enough to hold everyone together. Those closest to him, people who had spent decades working alongside him and defending his decisions, began to question whether their loyalty was worth the risk. The public eye was no longer captivated by Copeland's charisma. It was scrutinizing his every move, examining his finances, and piecing together the evidence of misused donations, offshore accounts, and manipulated ministry funds. The first major cracks appeared within his inner circle. Family members who had once been the public face of unwavering support began to retreat from the spotlight. Copeland's son-in-law, who had served as a financial advisor within the ministry, admitted in a tell-all interview that he had witnessed irregularities for years, but had felt powerless to speak out. "I saw things that didn't sit right with me," he said. "The money, the way it was handled, it was always about keeping it within the family, keeping the image perfect, and if you questioned anything, you were the problem." His words, broadcast widely, were like a dagger. They signaled to the world, and to other insiders, that Copeland's control was not absolute, and that even his closest allies had begun to see the cracks in the empire. Soon, others followed. Former staffers, financial managers, and even longtime ministry members stepped forward, recounting how they had been coerced, threatened, or pressured into compliance. There were stories of employees being fired or blacklisted for simply asking questions about missing funds, of personal intimidation and manipulation designed to keep anyone from speaking out. Testimonies revealed how the ministry had operated like a fortress, with layers of secrecy and fear protecting Copeland from scrutiny. But once the evidence of wrongdoing began surfacing publicly, that fortress began to fall apart. Perhaps the most painful betrayals came from those who had shared Copeland's mission in the most intimate ways.
Why have you said that you won't fly commercial? You said that it's like getting into a tube with a bunch of demons. Why do you think that?
No, listen to me just a second. Not the people. The main reason is because of the need. If I flew commercial, I'd have to stop 65% of what I'm doing. That's really the main.
Isn't it true that you want to fly commercial so that you can fly in luxury? How much money did you pay for Tyler Perry's Gulfstream jet, for example?
Well, for example, that's really none of your business, but...
Isn't it the business of your donors?
Listen, I paid. You kind of caught me off guard here, okay?
Certainly. Well, if you'd like to come out here, I'd like to give you a chance to catch your breath and have a conversation. We don't want to catch you off guard.
I love Inside Edition. You got to get this now. Hey, you listening to me? My wife thinks Inside Edition is, oh yeah. Now, thank you, Lord. Help me. Let me pray.
Well, let me just ask you a really simple question. A lot of people think it's unbecoming for a preacher to live a life of luxury and to fly around in private jets. What's your response to that?
Very simple. It takes a lot of money to do what we do.
His family. His daughter, who had been heavily involved in ministry broadcasts and had once stood by her father on national television, released a statement expressing deep regret for ever defending him. "I wanted to believe my father was a man of God," she said, her words filled with both sorrow and anger. "But now I see he was just a man, a deeply flawed one. I cannot in good conscience stand by him anymore." For Copeland, this was more than a public humiliation. It was a personal devastation. The woman who had grown up with him, who had spent her life helping build his image, had turned away, leaving him isolated. Gloria Copeland, Kenneth's wife and lifelong partner in the ministry, delivered an even harsher blow. For decades, she had been his right hand, standing beside him in broadcasts, sermons, and public appearances. But 3 months into his prison sentence, she filed for divorce, stating that she was separating herself from past actions to focus on her own spiritual journey. The announcement was swift and final. In a single stroke, the woman who had been his partner in faith and business erased him from the life they had shared. Without her support, Copeland's personal and spiritual world felt emptied, a void that mirrored the collapse of his professional empire. Outside of family, the broader network of followers and donors began to fracture. Those who had once believed wholeheartedly in Copeland's message of prosperity and divine favor felt betrayed. Stories of people who had given their life savings, mortgaged their homes, or maxed out credit cards in faith surfaced constantly in the media. One widow tearfully recounted how she had donated her late husband's life insurance, believing it would help others and bring blessings. Instead, the money funded a multi-million-dollar mansion for Copeland. These personal stories spread across news outlets and social media, eroding trust and loyalty. Donations, once the lifeblood of the ministry, plummeted. Television stations canceled broadcasts, and employees who had remained silent for years began resigning, unwilling to be associated with a ministry under investigation for fraud and exploitation. Even within prison, Copeland felt the effects of abandonment. Where once he had been revered, he now found himself powerless. Attempts to maintain authority or preach to fellow inmates were met with ridicule or indifference. The loyalty he had relied upon for decades had evaporated, leaving him alone with the consequences of his actions. Friends, allies, and supporters, who might have advocated for him, disappeared. The fortress of loyalty he had relied on for decades had crumbled, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and isolated. The unraveling of support was not just a professional collapse. It was deeply personal. Copeland had built his identity around being a spiritual leader, a figure whose authority was absolute and whose guidance was followed without question. The betrayal by those closest to him, family, advisors, staff, and followers, struck at the core of that identity. The same people who had elevated him now distanced themselves, leaving him to confront the consequences of his choices alone. By the time the final legal and financial repercussions were fully underway, Copeland's world had changed completely. His empire was dismantled, his wealth seized, and his support network shattered. Those who had once cheered his sermons, funded his lifestyle, and defended his reputation now regarded him with skepticism, disappointment, or anger. The man who had preached prosperity and divine favor for decades was left to face the stark reality of betrayal and abandonment. Alone in prison, stripped of wealth, status, and the adoration of followers, Kenneth Copeland finally confronted the consequences of a life built on the fragile foundations of loyalty that could not withstand the truth. This story of betrayal and collapse serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful or revered someone may appear, the loyalty of others is never guaranteed, especially when actions betray trust. Kenneth Copeland's fall was not just the story of a televangelist facing justice. It was the unraveling of a network of devotion, the erosion of faith in a leader, and the painful, isolating consequences of betrayal at every level of personal and professional life. After Kenneth Copeland's fall from grace, the world he had once controlled with such certainty seemed to vanish overnight. For decades, he had been at the center of a sprawling empire, a televangelist whose name drew instant recognition, whose words commanded loyalty, and whose life of luxury was admired and envied by many. Private jets, sprawling estates, golden fixtures, and a network of followers willing to give without question had defined his existence. But all of that was gone now, stripped away by legal consequences, public scrutiny, and the harsh reality of prison life. Life behind bars was a shock to Copeland's system. The routines, luxuries, and reverence he had grown accustomed to were replaced with a rigid schedule, shared spaces, and fellow inmates who treated him as nothing more than another man in a jumpsuit. Gone were the cheering crowds, the cameras, and the sense of divine purpose he had projected for decades. Where once his words carried spiritual authority, now they were met with indifference or mockery. When he tried to preach in the prison yard, attempting to recapture the power and presence he had cultivated on television, inmates laughed and heckled him. "Where's your private jet now, Pastor?" One sneered. The man who had preached prosperity, telling people to plant financial seeds and expect divine returns, had no platform, no audience, and no control. The reality of his fallen status seeped into every part of his existence. Copeland's days became monotonous, dictated by prison schedules, labor, and basic routines. His room was a small, cold cell, stark and unadorned, a far cry from the luxurious homes he had once owned. Meals were the same for everyone, devoid of the richness he had once taken for granted. Privacy, power, and influence, the hallmarks of his life, were gone. Even the remaining members of his ministry could no longer shield him from reality. Television broadcasts were canceled, donations evaporated, and the empire he had built for decades was crumbling. Each passing day brought another reminder that the world outside had moved on. The financial consequences were relentless. The IRS, having uncovered offshore accounts, shell corporations, and hidden assets, moved aggressively to reclaim funds. Properties, including his lavish vacation homes and estates, were seized. Luxury items, cars, jewelry, art were confiscated. Each forfeiture was a tangible reminder of the life he had lost. The image he had meticulously cultivated now reduced to nothing more than court documents and headlines. Copeland had once represented prosperity gospel at its peak, promising abundance and divine reward. Yet now the world could see the cost of that lifestyle and the emptiness beneath it. Beyond finances, personal relationships disintegrated. Family members who had once appeared unwavering now distanced themselves. His daughter, who had worked alongside him in ministry broadcasts, publicly condemned him, unable to reconcile the father she had known with the man convicted of financial crimes. Gloria Copeland, his wife and longtime partner, filed for divorce, citing a desire to focus on her own spiritual path and sever connections with past actions. Copeland, who had relied on his family for support, now found himself completely isolated, stripped not only of wealth and power, but of the intimacy and loyalty he had once depended on. Even the public, once captivated by his charisma and promises of divine blessings, turned away. Devotees who had sacrificed everything, donating life savings and pensions in faith, felt betrayed. Stories of widowhood, bankruptcy, and shattered hope filled news reports and social media feeds, reinforcing the narrative of Copeland's fall. The very audience that had elevated him was now the lens through which his legacy would be judged, a testament not to his spiritual guidance, but to the consequences of deception and abuse of trust. Prison offered no solace, only reflection. Copeland, once accustomed to crafting messages and controlling narratives, now had nothing but time and isolation. He spent hours in silence, contemplating not just the life he had lost, but the consequences of actions that had once seemed justified. Was it ambition, pride, blind devotion to material symbols of success? Perhaps all of these had combined to create a fall so catastrophic that even his former influence could not repair it. In the confines of a cell, he was stripped of all illusions. The man who had been untouchable now faced a new reality, a life without power, without reverence, and without the trappings of fame. Health challenges compounded his struggles. The stress, humiliation, and weight of lost wealth and influence took a physical toll. Years of high-stakes living and public scrutiny, combined with the rigors of prison life, left him vulnerable. He became frail, his once commanding presence reduced to that of an aging man battling illness, reflection, and regret. Reports indicated that strokes and other health issues plagued his final months, leaving him weak and dependent. In these moments, the full magnitude of his downfall was undeniable. The man who once towered over the world of televangelism now faced the inevitability of mortality alone and stripped of everything he had worked for. Copeland's legacy, once seen as a beacon of prosperity gospel and divine favor, became overshadowed by scandal. His story transformed from that of a spiritual leader to a cautionary tale, a lesson in hubris, deception, and the fragility of power built on wealth and control. The ministries, the broadcasts, and the lavish lifestyle were reduced to news clippings, legal records, and the memories of those he had impacted,